Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 11 of my series on the Mexican Revolution, the Convention at Queretaro. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico had prompted an American expedition into Mexico to hunt for Villa, while calm heads on both sides of the border had managed to prevent a full-scale war. Neither side caught Villa, but he failed to regain his former power. Meanwhile, President Venustiano Carranza had solidified his control over most of Mexico, since the few remaining revolts were local and isolated from each other. After 6 years of warfare, large parts of Mexico were filled with starving peasants, crippled veterans, and abandoned factories and mines. In particular, Mexico's laboriously constructed railway infrastructure was in ruins. Therefore, it was impossible to transport crops from the functioning parts of Mexico to the starving areas, which spread famine. Despite this daunting situation, Carranza imposed his will on Mexico, censoring the newspapers, filling the civil service with his own loyalists, and ruthlessly stamping out any form of opposition. Promotion in Carranza's civil service and army depended solely on loyalty, and he proved to be a more determined autocrat than either Diaz or Huerta. However, his defense of Mexico's sovereignty was both genuine and well received. Faced with the very likely threat of defeat at the start of the Civil War with Pancho Villa, Carranza announced a land reform decree on January 6, 1915. Admittedly, he did it out of desperation, but he made the announcement. On January 29th, he decreed that labor legislation was now the responsibility of the federal government, and his government then made an agreement with the labor union Casa del Obrero Mundial, House of the World Worker, where the union provided red battalions in exchange for the right to organize and capture territory. The battalions were called red battalions because they recruited leftists. The exact number of volunteers is unknown, but was roughly several thousand. To be fair, these decrees would not have been sufficient without Obregon's victories at Celaya and León in April and June, but they still showed that the Carrancistas were at least acting like a national government. Still, Carranza was no Democrat, or rather, he preferred an older, more limited form of democracy. Believing that he represented the national will, he expected legislators to follow his instructions without question. Refusing to cooperate with other parties in the legislature, he never bothered to create his own party, preferring paternalistic authoritarianism instead. That authoritarianism had little patience for strikes. The economy was struggling, and inflation had greatly reduced workers' buying power, which fueled strikes. As I said, Carranza had made the pact with the Casa out of desperation, and following Obregon's victories, his government felt free to move against the labor movement. The red battalions had been integrated into the main army, so they posed no threat, enabling Carranza to put down a general strike in Mexico City in the summer of 1916. The strike leaders were arrested and the offices of the Casa were occupied, eliminating it as an effective organization. Several labor leaders would have been executed, except for Obregon's interference, which further strengthened the relationship between Obregon and labor. People were desperate for stability, so the union would not find much support. But Carranza himself still did not inspire much popularity. Through his victories and political activism, Obregon had become a national figure, which was not welcomed by Carranza. Although American troops were marching around northern Mexico hunting Pancho Villa and Zapata remained defiant in Morelos, Carranza still felt sufficiently secure to announce on June 12th that municipal elections would be held. This should have been followed by an announcement that elections would be held for Congress. Instead, on September 14th, he called for delegates to a constitutional convention to replace the Constitution of 1857, which was a stunning development since he had rebelled to restore the Constitution of 1857, and his entire movement was called the Constitutionalist Movement. Attending the start of the convention at Queretaro on December 1st, Carranza made a speech that listed the flaws of the existing constitution and outlined his proposed changes. It soon became clear that he had underestimated the widespread desire for reform. In particular, his platform ignored property rights and agrarian reform, left labor rights to Congress, and only mentioned a few minor anti-clerical provisions. The situation boiled down to one key issue. Carranza did not see any need for major changes because he was 56 and was a member of a wealthy, influential family. He had fought against Huerta because Huerta was a destructive dictator, and he'd fought against Villa out of self-preservation. Believing that social reform should be left to Congress, Carranza's draft focused on the principle of no re-election, and military officers were unable to run for political office. The delegates were younger, most were middle class, and they had experienced massive chaos, driven largely by economic inequality, so they had little interest in blindly rubber-stamping a draft by an old patriarchal head of a rich family. The key committee on the Constitution was composed of leftists, especially Francisco Mujica, who was president of the committee. After joining Carranza's constitutionalist movement, Mujica had risen quickly until he became governor of Tabasco, gaining a reputation as an effective reformer and administrator. Unsurprisingly, the church was a major issue. It had directly financed the conservative revolt in 1857 and then backed Porfiro Diaz since he had restored much of its power. It had opposed Francisco Madero when he ran for president after overthrowing Diaz and then supported Victoriano Huerta, hoping for another Diaz. Carranza attended the debate on the church's role in education, and when he saw that his proposals had been replaced completely by radical proposals, he realized that he had lost control of the convention, so he did not attend any more debates. Actually, the majority of the delegates were opposed to the church's involvement in education. They mainly disagreed on where the requirement for free, mandatory secular education should be placed in the Constitution, finally putting it in Article 3. When the convention began to deal with labor issues, Carranza's supporters took the initiative to propose a relatively radical set of rules governing labor that incorporated aspects of labor laws in the U.S. and European nations. Given his actions several months earlier, it is unlikely that Carranza had become a convert to unions, but his followers in the convention recognized that labor rules like an 8-hour day, an end to nighttime work for women and children, and the right to strike with collective bargaining would pass with or without their support, so they moved first to claim the credit. In the end, the labor provisions of Article 123 passed without opposition. Even so, the leftists still shaped the platform to their satisfaction, so it was a victory for everyone, especially laborers. So far, the convention had proceeded relatively smoothly and had not greatly challenged the existing order. Then the delegates began to deal with Article 27, which covered agrarian issues. Carranza's initial proposal had barely mentioned agrarian reform, but the radicals were determined to make agrarian reform part of the Constitution. The argument that land reform should be settled in Congress was criticized by delegates who pointed out that the Terraza Creel faction had used its influence to defeat any proposals for agrarian land reform, so it had to be settled in the convention where the faction had little influence. The article passed with a strong majority and represents a break with Porfiro Diaz's policy that economic growth was more important than individual land rights. If the article was enforced, the vested economic interests, largely foreign, would lose much of their advantage. The key issue was paragraph 1, which states that only Mexicans and Mexican companies may obtain concessions to develop mines or mineral fuels. The state may grant the same right to foreigners if they pledge to act as Mexican nationals and not invoke the protection of their governments in regard to their operations. Unsurprisingly, Article 27 was hated by oil companies, since it gave subsoil rights to the government, not private companies. Although Carranza attended the final session of the convention and a banquet was held in his honor, his followers had clearly failed to control the convention. However, it would probably be a stretch to say that the radicals were allies of Obregon. Admittedly, he had influence with them, but they were not an organized party, simply a group of delegates with shared goals. Busy with campaigns against Villa and Zapata, he had only briefly attended the convention. Actually, neither side won a complete victory. Carranza gained more powers for the presidency and a much weakened legislature, but the radicals obtained an 8-hour workday, abolition of child labor, land reform, the introduction of arbitration for strikes, and compensation when workers were fired. Carranza and Obregon had clashed over Carranza's favorable attitude towards hacendados and former Huertistas, as well as his increasingly obvious reluctance to actually enforce land reform. Emboldened by the neutralization of Villa, Carranza further limited the power of Obregon but made him Minister of War after Villa attacked Columbus. As minister, Obregon worked to professionalize the army and reduce the autonomy of regional warlords as much as possible. Obregon remained Minister of War until the 1917 presidential and congressional election. Initially considering running against Carranza, his poor health and unwillingness to threaten the precarious stability by an open break with Carranza led him to abandon the idea. Once the convention had concluded, elections for Congress and the presidency could be held in March, although Morelos was the only state in Mexico to not take part. Running without serious opposition, Carranza easily won election as president. While the elections were not entirely fair, there was a chance for peace. Oil tycoon Edward Doheny and other industrialists had viewed the hunt for Villa as clumsy, since they simply wanted American troops to protect their properties. When President Wilson realized that a full-scale Mexican invasion was both unnecessary and insane, given the situation in Europe, Doheny launched a publicity campaign to convince American voters that American fuel supplies were under threat. His approach was straightforward. He paid journalists to write pro-intervention editorials in newspapers, which naturally had some effect, but not enough to pressure the U.S. government to basically send an army into Mexico to guard his properties. So he worked with other businessmen to make an arrangement with Peles to pay for stability in Tampico. As I said, Article 27 directly threatened Doheny's holdings, so he responded by funneling more money to Peles, who denounced the Carranza government and the new constitution on May 5th. While the announcement sounded nice, he still lacked a serious army, and he only controlled the area around the oil fields, not the ports of Tampico and Veracruz, which had the refineries, storage facilities, and shipping docks, essentially the infrastructure required to actually export oil. Meanwhile, Carranza had decided to end the threat of Peles and launched a campaign against the Cedillo family at the same time. A key ally of the Cedillo family had accepted an amnesty in late 1916, but was imprisoned and executed in February, which sparked a series of reprisals by the Cedillos. In November 1917, Peles made an agreement with the Cedillo brothers simply because they shared a common enemy in Carranza and were located relatively near each other, but neither side made an effort to become part of a bigger movement. Speaking of the lack of an organized national resistance, what has Zapata been up to? Turning his back on the struggle between Villa and Obregon, Zapata remained in Morelos, overseeing land reform. Morelos was at peace for the first time since the start of the revolution. Zapata was the supreme chief of the revolution, Manuel Palafox had become the federal secretary of agriculture, and former guerrilla Genevieve de la O had been elected governor by the Zapatista chieftains. Land reform proved complicated, since villages often had conflicting claims. Landmarks like the large fig tree made settling boundaries a frustrating task, and villagers were sometimes reluctant to accept the judgments made by the agricultural commissions, which were mainly composed of young engineers from the cities. However, the engineers had a genuine desire to help and gradually won over many villagers. There were other challenges, since Palafox was a socialist who wanted to expropriate all land. Zapata struggled to balance the needs of the farmers and the hacienda owners who were willing to cooperate, realizing that cash crops were needed to earn money to buy better tools, repair damaged mills, and reboot the economy. However, land reform had progressed far enough that the haciendas had disappeared from Morelos by the summer of 1915, and the state resembled the mythical world of small peasant communities that Zapata and his followers believed was the natural order. Fixated on Morelos, Zapata paid little attention to events in the rest of Mexico, even though they would have a fatal impact on the state. Villa's continued defeats meant that Zapata no longer held the balance of power, since Obregon and Carranza had become too powerful for him to face on his own. Federal troops under Pablo Gonzalez occupied Mexico City, driving out Zapata's troops, possessing a powerful dislike of the capital. Zapata was probably not extremely concerned. However, the defeat had consequences. Deprived of access to the capital, Zapata no longer had a stable source of ammunition or the large-scale printing press needed to print enough money to pay his troops and the state government staff. Morale plummeted since troops had gotten used to being paid semi-regularly and did not want to return to depending on handouts from the villages. Presuming that Carranza's coalition would fall apart just like Huerta's had, Zapata continued his guerrilla raids, but many of his commanders saw the changing wind and submitted to Carranza, which eroded the bonds of trust needed to keep a widespread guerrilla movement functioning. Once Villa's army had been destroyed, Carranza sent 20,000 men to join the 10,000 troops already in Morelos, driving even more Zapatista chieftains to sue for peace. After heavy fighting in the spring, Gonzalez had captured Zapata's headquarters by mid-June 1916, and Zapata had retreated to the mountains as a guerrilla. Determined to win total victory, Gonzalez resolved to deny Zapata the supplies needed to feed his guerrillas. What they could not loot, Gonzalez's men burned, systematically transforming the state into a wasteland. However, Zapata was not beaten so easily. Dividing his army into bands of roughly 200 men, he spread them out over the state to make them harder to find and easier to supply. Smaller federal garrisons were destroyed and larger ones had to fight off powerful attacks, so he maintained a relentless pressure against the federals. Zapata had also learned the value of destroying property like railways, factories, and mills to show foreign investors that Carranza did not control Mexico. A less intelligent but equally brutal version of Huerta, Gonzalez responded with mass executions. In return, Zapata began blowing up trains, killing both civilians and troops. The situation looked grim, but outside events gave the Zapatistas a reprieve. The strain of keeping an army hunting Villa, an army monitoring Pershing's expedition, and yet another to deal with a recent rebellion by Felix Diaz meant that Carranza could not reinforce Gonzalez. Worse, Gonzalez's refusal to pay attention to his troops' health left them vulnerable to malaria and dysentery, and 7,000 soldiers had died by December 1916. Zapata saw his chance and launched another offensive, driving Gonzalez out of Morelos by January 1st. Resisting the urge to march on Mexico City, Zapata concentrated on restarting his agrarian program. Carranza's refusal to cooperate during the punitive expedition ensured that he was not Woodrow Wilson's favorite person. To be fair, Carranza was probably not many people's favorite person, but Wilson mattered, so the United States imposed an arms embargo and limited cross-border trade. Since relations between Mexico and the U.S. were strained, Mexico needed a friend, and Germany was that friend. Mexican-German cooperation grew after the punitive expedition ended because Germany had made few protests against Carranza's decrees on mining and exports. Germany was permitted to subsidize Mexican newspapers that advocated a pro-German line during World War I, and German espionage was clearly tolerated. However, the German government overreached itself when Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, sent a coded telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico on January 16, 1917, instructing the ambassador to offer the Mexican government military support if it invaded the United States to retake Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. This offer seems strange, since the Mexican government barely controlled Mexico, and the much larger American army would very likely crush a Mexican invasion. Also, Germany was otherwise occupied with a bloody stalemate on the Western Front. So, why make the offer in the first place? Britain and France depended on supplies from neutral America, and the German High Command hoped to strangle Britain through unrestricted U-boat warfare starting in February. Sinking neutral ships would likely drive neutral America to enter the war on the Allied side. But the German High Command expected that submarines would force the Allies to surrender within 6 months, and the United States could not recruit, train, and transport an army to Europe in that time. A Mexican invasion would hopefully keep the United States occupied long enough for the submarines to starve Britain into capitulation. Unfortunately, the telegram was intercepted and deciphered by the British and sent to President Wilson. Its publication on March 1st helped swing American opinion against Germany. Despite Carranza's clear support for Germany, he remained officially neutral because he realized that Mexico simply could not bear the instability caused by a real American invasion. Furthermore, Germany's offer of financial support to purchase weapons was meaningless, since the only large-scale arms manufacturer in the region was the United States, and the Royal Navy's blockade of Germany prevented the Germans from supplying Mexico directly. To sum up, a convention to write a new constitution resulted in surprising victories for the radicals, including stronger labor laws and agrarian reform. Carranza easily won election as president, but another attempt to crush the Zapatista revolt failed, even though much of Morelos was turned into a wasteland. Aside from the challenge of walking a diplomatic tightrope between Germany and the United States, Carranza found himself faced with a new revolt. This may come as a surprise, but Felix Diaz had become a major player, largely because Huerta's death left Diaz the unchallenged leader of Mexican conservatives. Seeing an opportunity, Diaz launched a revolt, which I will discuss next episode. Thanks for listening.